There is a tablet in the collections of a major American research museum, catalogued, photographed, assigned a number that has never received a complete published edition. That is not unusual. What is unusual is what sits in the middle of it, embedded inside what the cataloguer described as a land survey formula. A vertical count, 7 divisions below the surface of the earth, each one named, each one populated, each described with the same dry, unhurried precision, the same scribal tradition used to record grain deliveries and canal depths. Not a hymn. Not a creation myth, with God striding through golden light. A list. The kind of document you produce when you are recording something that exists. 7 levels beneath the earth, and at each one, something waiting. That is what we are going to examine today. One level at a time, and I will tell you, at each one, exactly what the evidence says, what it does not say, and why the careful version of this keeps turning out to be the harder one to explain away. My name is Dr. William Carver. I've spent 40 years with my hands in the sand of ancient Egypt, but the document that sent me back to my desk for 3 days running was not Egyptian. It came out of a pre-war excavation crate. I was helping a colleague sort through tablets from southern Mesopotamia, most of them exactly as dull as you would expect. Receipts and labor logs and school exercises where a boy had copied the same wedge sign 40 times and still gotten it wrong on the 39th. And then this one, the tablet the cataloguer had written up as a land survey fragment. It was not. If you want the real story, these old texts actually tell, not the myths, but what the clay and the stone say when you read them precisely. Subscribe. And this is what I dig into here every week. Let me pause here. There are certain things I cannot talk about on YouTube because YouTube doesn't like it. I put all the unfiltered stuff into the 3 volumes on the QR code on screen or the pinned comment with the link. I'll leave it at that. So let us go down, one level at a time, starting at the surface, and what the Mesopotamians said was directly beneath it. Before we do, let me be plain about what Mesopotamia is and why it matters for a question like this. Southern Iraq, the flat, hot country between the Tigris and the Euphrates. 5,000 years ago, the people living there had no stone worth quarrying and almost no timber. What they had was mud. So they built their cities out of mud. And when they needed to remember something, they pressed a cut reed into a palm-flattened lump of river clay and left it in the sun. That should have been the most fragile record any civilization ever kept. It turned out to be the most durable, because when a city burns, papyrus goes with it, and parchment goes with it, but clay only bakes harder. That accident of chemistry is the reason we can read the Mesopotamians at all, and the reason we can read them in such extraordinary volume. There are something on the order of 500,000 cuneiform tablets in museum collections today. The overwhelming majority of them are dull, and I want to say that plainly from the start, because it matters. Receipts, barley rations, a lawsuit over a stolen ox. But running underneath that enormous archive of the ordinary is a smaller body of text that is not ordinary in the least. Hymns, laments, lists of kings said to have reigned for tens of thousands of years, a flood account written down 1,000 years before Genesis, and underneath all of it, assumed rather than argued, a picture of the world that does not look like ours. Level 1. The first earth below, the shallow country. The uppermost subsurface layer in Mesopotamian cosmological texts is not, in the first instance, a place of the dead. It is a working zone, the domain of roots, buried foundations, the underside of the inhabited world. Standard scholarship treats this layer as cosmographic scaffolding. The earth has a top face for the living and a bottom face that grades into something else, and the first layer is simply that underside, the bottom of what we stand on. And then you look at the word. The Akkadian term most often rendered as foundation or deep soil in these texts is urshetu. Translated plainly, it means earth, ground, land, interchangeable in most contexts with the surface itself. But in the cosmological layer texts, ersetu is qualified by a second term that changes its weight considerably. Ersitu, Rapashtu, the wide earth, the broad earth, not deep, not low, wide. The adjective implies extension in the horizontal plane, not descent, which means the scribes were not describing something beneath us so much as something beside us, a parallel extent of ground, running at the same level but beyond the edges of the inhabited world, curving under and around. That is not a floor beneath our floor. That is a lateral country you cannot reach by digging. Hold that image, it will come back. Certain ritual texts, specifically a group of incantation series associated with the god Ea, the lord of the sweet waters and of wisdom, address practitioners as operating in the first earth, while simultaneously conducting business in the human world. The grammar is not retrospective or aspirational. It is locative present. They are here and there at once. The ritual language of Mesopotamian incantation is deliberately liminal, placing the speaker between worlds as a formal convention, and I do not want to overclaim on that point. But the consistent choice of wide over deep is harder to wave away. Someone chose that adjective, and they chose it repeatedly across texts that were not written by the same hand or in the same century. Level 2. The Road of No Return. The First Gate Country. This is where the underworld proper begins in most scholarly treatments, the threshold zone, the anteroom of death. The road to the underworld, in Akkadian the Urehu Shala Tari, the road from which there is no returning, begins here, and the gate figures associated with it are well documented across incantation texts and descent poetry. Here is what caught my attention. The gatekeeper at this level is not a god. In the best preserved texts, the figure stationed at the entry is described in terms that map far more precisely onto a human bureaucrat than onto a supernatural guardian. He has a title and a function and a record-keeping role. He does not judge. He logs. Arrivals are registered using the same verb applied in administrative texts to incoming goods at a temple storehouse. The dead, at level 2, are being inventoried. There is a damaged tablet late Assyrian library context, provenance listed in the catalog as Nineveh region, exact find spot unrecorded that gives this gatekeeper a second function that appears, as far as I have been able to determine, nowhere else in the surviving corpus. He is described as holding a count, a running total, and the text breaks off before it specifies what is being counted. I am going to ask you to hold on to that. The count has an answer, but the answer is not at this level. The bureaucratic flavor of the level 2 material is, to me, the most genuinely interesting thing about it. Mesopotamia invented accounting. When they describe the entry to the afterlife using accounting language, I do not think that is decoration. I think it is the only vocabulary they trusted to be precise. A people who recorded every jar of oil and every day of temple labor applied the same instinct to the administration of death. There is something almost moving about that, if you let it sit. Level 3. The Land of Dust. The Quiet City. This is where most of the dead actually live in the Mesopotamian imagination. A gray, featureless country where the dead eat dust and clay, wear garments described as feathers, and exist in a diminished version of their living selves. This is well attested in descent poetry, in laments, in letters to the dead, which is a genuine ancient Near Eastern genre that deserves more attention than it gets. People wrote letters addressed to deceased relatives and deposited them in tombs, expecting them to be read and acted upon. The dead were not considered entirely absent. They were considered elsewhere, reachable in principle, able to intercede or to complain. The Quiet City, a name for this level used in several texts, is described as having a layout, streets, districts, what appears to be a market area. The dead of different social circumstances occupy different quarters, a mid-period Babylonian text. And I want to be careful here because this category of text is genuinely difficult to date and contextualize. The text lists what reads as a topography of the city below, with named areas corresponding to different categories of person. Those who died in battle, those who died in childbirth, those who were not properly buried. These groups appear to inhabit distinct neighborhoods, and the text implies, without stating outright, that movement between those neighborhoods is not straightforward. The sensational reading of this material is that it is a literal description of a physical underground city. I do not believe that, and the sensational reading is also the less interesting one. The sober reading is that this is a Mesopotamian city, mapped onto the afterlife of people so thoroughly urban, so entirely shaped by the reality of streets and districts and the social geography of a walled city, that they could not imagine any organized existence without those features. And so they gave the dead a city, because that was what organization looked like to them. A civilization so committed to the idea of civic order that it extended city planning beyond death has told us something profound about itself. That picture is harder to put down than any lost underground settlement, and it has the advantage of being what the evidence actually supports. Level 4. The crossing level, the place of division. This is the least attested layer in the mainstream literature, and I want to be honest about why. Because this is the point where a video like this one can go wrong if it is not careful. Level 4 appears as a structural interstitial, a layer between the known dead and the older, deeper entities described below. Several serious scholars have questioned whether the Mesopotamian system was ever truly 7-tiered, rather than 3-tiered with elaborations. That is not a dismissal. It is a reasonable methodological concern, and it has not been settled. The reason the Level 4 texts are sparse is not because the Mesopotamians did not think about this layer. It is because the bulk of the tablets that would address it are still unread. The British Museum alone holds somewhere in excess of 130,000 cuneiform tablets. The current estimate for tablets that have received a complete scholarly edition, full transliteration, translation, and commentary is roughly 30,000. The rest are catalogued, often photographed, but not yet published. The deep cosmological series, the ones that go beyond the standard funerary and mythological texts into more technical theological territory, are disproportionately in that unpublished backlog. This is not suppression. The scholars who work cuneiform are few, the tablets are many, and a complete edition of a single difficult text can take a researcher several years. The Level 4 gap is a queue, not a locked door. But the cost of the queue is real. We are drawing conclusions about this cosmological system from roughly a quarter of the surviving evidence. That is worth saying plainly. In the texts we do have, Level 4 functions as a membrane rather than a residence, a place things pass through rather than inhabit. And the things that pass through it are not always the dead. Certain categories of beings in Mesopotamian magical texts are described as rising from below the 4th level, implying they originated in the deeper strata and had to cross this one to reach the surface world. The direction of travel is up. Something lives below and sometimes comes up through. I will not build more than the text's support on that. But I will note it. Level 5. The older country. The pre-flood stratum. Below the ordinary dead, certain cosmological texts describe entities and conditions that predate the current world order beings and circumstances from before the flood or before the creation of humanity, settled in the deeper levels. Standard scholarship reads this as theological deep time, the underworld as repository for everything cleared away when the current world was made. That is a reasonable reading, and it covers much of the material. Here is the part that does not fit neatly into it. The same phrase Ershitu Rapashtu, the wide earth, reappears in the Level 5 material. I told you to hold that image, and here is why. But in the Level 5 context, it is modified differently. A bilingual Sumerian-Akkadian composition from Nippur, currently held in the University of Pennsylvania collection, uses a construction that most translators render as the ancient wide earth, but which more precisely reads as the wide earth that was before. Not ancient in the sense of old but continuous. Before, in the sense of prior to, as though this stratum predates the upper world rather than sitting beneath it. A country that was there first, not a country that is merely deeper. And the entities described at this level are not monsters. They are not the punished. They are not simply the dead. They are described as builders. The Akkadian term used is the same one applied to skilled artisans who built temples in the mythological texts, Manu, master craftsman. Something is being constructed at level 5, and the surviving texts do not say what. I have no explanation for that I would defend in print. I am telling you it is there. Level 6. The 7 judges. The tribunal level. The 6th level in the layered underworld texts is the location of the great tribunal. 7 judges called in Akkadian the Anunnaku, meaning something close to those of princely seed who determine the fates of the dead. This is well attested, cross-referenced across multiple text families, and discussed at length in serious scholarship. The 7 judges are real and documented, and appear consistently enough that there is no reasonable dispute about their place in the system. Here is the detail that receives almost no attention in popular treatments of this material. The Anunnaku in their underworld role are described in one hymn text as having themselves been judged. The hymn is addressed to them directly and opens with a recollection of their own descent. They did not originate below. They were placed below, assigned there, sent down. The language used for their assignment to the 6th level is the same verb used in administrative and royal texts for the deportation of conquered populations to new territories. They were, on this reading, relocated, resettled, and they are now administering justice from a station they were assigned rather than born to, governing a country they were sent to rather than chose. That is, in the text. It is not obscure. I find myself genuinely uncertain why it receives so little attention, because the implication that the judges of the dead are themselves exiles, issuing verdicts from a place they did not choose, is one of the more quietly strange things I have found in 40 years of working with ancient documents. An entire judicial system, staffed by the displaced. Whether the Babylonian scribes intended that irony, or simply recorded what their tradition told them, I cannot say, but they recorded it. Level 7. The deepest water. The thing below everything. The 7th level is the Apsu, the great underground freshwater ocean upon which the earth floats. This is foundational Mesopotamian cosmology, uncontroversial, taught in every introductory course on the ancient Near East, and worth describing carefully precisely because it is so well established and still so easy to underestimate. The Apsu belongs to Ea, the god of wisdom and of the sweet waters. His temple at Eridu, one of the oldest cities in the world by any reasonable measure of the evidence, was built over what the Mesopotamians believed was a direct physical connection to it. A drain, in effect, a pipe running from the sacred precinct down to the water below. Rituals performed at that temple were understood to communicate directly with the Apsu, with Ea, with the source of wisdom and fresh water alike, because in the Mesopotamian conception those were not separate things. Now, the gatekeeper at level 2, the broken tablet, the running count with no object. Here is where it finds a possible resolution. A separate tablet from an Eridu context, describing the Apsu as the source of a particular category of sacred water used in purification rituals, uses a verb to describe that water's movement. It rises. It is counted up from below. And the verb is the same root. What the gatekeeper at the entry level was tallying may not have been souls at all. It may have been the measure of sacred water flowing upward through the system, a hydraulic accounting that treated the entire underworld as a vertical diagram connecting the surface world to the cosmic ocean below, a cosmic plumbing system with a clerk at the top logging the flow from the bottom. That is the prosaic version of the count, and I think it is probably correct. And it is, if you sit with it, a picture of remarkable coherence, a civilization imagining the underworld not as a passive storage space for the dead, but as an active system with flow, with measurement, with a gatekeeper logging the movement of something from the bottom up through 6 layers to the surface, a bureaucracy that extended from the living city all the way down to the primordial water and back again. Now let me take you to Eridu, the actual city, in the actual ground. Eridu sits in the far south of what is now Iraq, near the edge of what was once the ancient shoreline of the Persian Gulf before millennia of sediment from the Tigris and Euphrates pushed the coast further out. Excavations at the site, in the mid-20th century, revealed something that has not received the attention it deserves outside of specialist literature. A sequence of temples, one stacked directly on top of the next, each new building raised on the ruins of the last, going down into the ground in a continuous sequence through the Ubaid period. 17 building phases, the earliest at the bottom date to approximately 5,500 years before our era. That places them at or near the earliest evidence of settled occupation anywhere in southern Mesopotamia. The Mesopotamians themselves said Eridu was the first city founded after kingship descended from heaven, in the language of the king lists. And they said its first temple stood directly over the Apsu. Excavators found 17 layers of temple going down. They did not reach the bottom. The lowest levels were not fully exposed. The water table rose. Conditions in the field became difficult. The excavations were not completed. What lies below the lowest exposed temple floor at Eridu remains, in the strict sense, unknown. Not sealed by a committee, not locked by a government. Unfinished. For the ordinary reasons field archaeology goes unfinished. Water, funding, political circumstance, time. The cost of that is simply that the question stays open. And Eridu, the first city, the city built over the Apsu, the city whose temple sequence goes down further than anyone has yet excavated, is sitting in the ground in southern Iraq, waiting on conditions that make it possible to go back in. That may be a long wait. Let me pause here for a moment, because there is more in this territory than one sitting can hold. If you want to read further into the layer texts, the actual tablet series, what the Eridu excavations found level by level, and what the published scholarship says about the gaps, I have put together a reading guide on the site. No pitch involved. Just the texts and where to find them. It is pinned at the top of the page if you want it. Now back to where we were. Here is what strikes me when I step back from all 7 levels and look at the shape of the whole thing. The Mesopotamian layered underworld is not the only ancient tradition to describe a stratified descent. The Hittites, working from a borrowed but substantially adapted Mesopotamian cosmological base, described multiple levels below the earth in ritual texts recovered from Hattusa, the great Hittite imperial capital in what is now central Turkey, the site now called Boghazköy. Roughly 30,000 tablet fragments came out of the archives there during excavation in the early 20th century, representing multiple languages: Hittite, Luwian, Hurrian, Akkadian, all in the same palace library. The Hittite material is in a worse state than the Mesopotamian, fragmented, multilingual, and substantially unpublished, but the structural echo is there. Layers, gates, specific entities resident at specific depths. A people who borrowed Mesopotamian cosmology and still reproduced the same architecture of descent. The Egyptian Amduat, the great funerary guide to the night journey of the sun through the hours below, divides the hidden world into 12 sections rather than 7. Different number. Identical structure. A stratified, administered, mapped underworld with specific populations at specific depths, governed by specific laws, traversable in a specific sequence. A journey you can describe step by step, gate by gate, because someone at some point decided the dark below was not shapeless. It had a shape. It could be learned. 3 separate ancient traditions, each in genuine contact with at least one of the others, all arriving independently at the same structural solution. Not chaos below, not simply darkness, a counted, organized, gate-kept descent, with levels and names, and something different waiting at each one. I will not tell you that convergence proves a shared memory of something physically real beneath the earth. That is further than the evidence goes, and I am not going there. But the convergence is the kind of thing that deserves careful attention rather than a quick filing under comparative mythology. 3 traditions, different numbers, identical architecture. Why that answer? Out of all the possible answers to the question of what lies below, and then there is the number itself, 7. It is not exclusive to the Mesopotamian tradition. It appears with a persistence that makes pattern hunters excited and historians cautious in stratified descent narratives across the ancient world. 7 gates, 7 levels, 7 judges, 7 days of something. I am not going to tell you the number is a code. I am going to tell you that when the same numerical structure appears in administrative documents, in hymn texts, in incantation series, and in descent poetry across multiple centuries and multiple languages within a single tradition, that is not a coincidence of phrasing. The Mesopotamians chose 7 deliberately and consistently for the structure of the world below. Whether they chose it because it matched something they believed about physical reality, or because the number had an organizational significance we do not fully understand yet, or because it was inherited from a tradition older than any tablet we have yet read, I do not know, and I will not pretend to. Here is the honest summary. The Mesopotamian 7-level underworld is a genuine, documented feature of cuneiform religious literature. The administrative vocabulary gatekeepers, logs, counts, judges, craftsmen, a hydraulic system with measurement built in, is real and consistent across texts that were not written by the same hand or in the same century. The wide earth qualifier appears more than once. The exile status of the judges is in the hymn. The umanu, the builders, are at level 5, and the texts do not explain what they are building. All of that is there. What is not there is physical evidence for any of it. Not a tunnel, not a chamber, not a stratum of material culture that matches the description. What we have is a written account produced by the most administratively precise civilization of the ancient world, describing the structure below the surface of the earth, in the same language and with the same conventions they used to describe the surface. I cannot tell you whether the scribes who produced these texts believed they were recording something real or constructing something useful. I am not sure that distinction, in the world they inhabited, was as clear as it is for us. What I can tell you is this. The oldest writing we have treats death as a system to be administered. 7 levels, named and mapped, with flow running from the bottom up, an account kept at the top, and builders working at level 5 for reasons the texts decline to explain. Whether that is cosmology, or memory, or the organizational instinct of a record-keeping culture dressed in divine language and applied to the one territory they could not actually survey, it tells us something true about the people who produced it. They could not leave the dark unmapped. They looked at the space below the ground, and they decided it had a floor plan. And then they decided it had 7 floor plans. And then they put a clerk at the door. After 40 years of reading what the ancient world left behind, I find that impulse, the refusal to let chaos go unnamed, the insistence that even the underworld must have an administration to be one of the most recognizable things our kind has ever done. A civilization that built its theology on accounting was always going to draw a floor plan of the afterlife. The wonder is not that they were wrong about the depth. The wonder is how determined they were to get the count right. Next time, we go into the sealed temple libraries, the catalogued but unread archives sitting in several different museum basements, and the few texts that have emerged from them in the last decade that have quietly adjusted things scholars thought were settled, not a revelation, an adjustment. But in this field, adjustments are how the story actually moves. Until then, read what the tablets says, not what the translation tells you it says. Those are not always the same sentence.